A new report for the Progressive Policy Institute is warning that if Democrats refuse to confront the political reality that their policies are not in line with the priorities of the majority of Americans, they are in big, big trouble. According to analysts William Galston and Elaine Kamarck, who both served in the Clinton administration and are currently scholars at the Brookings Institution, Democrats have convinced themselves of three things that are little more than what they call, quote, persistent myths about the electorate. One, that people of color all think, act, and vote in the same way. Two, that economics are more important than culture. And three, that there is a looming progressive majority in the United States. The analysis also shows a party that has lost touch with swing voters who will ultimately decide national elections. They argue that in an age of close presidential elections, just one of the last six was decided by more than 5 points, it's not enough to mobilize a party's base. If Democrats want to win, they have to cater to those swing voters. And these missteps by Democrats seem to be backed up by recent polling. President Biden now has about a 43% approval rating, second lowest approval rating of any president 1 year into their term. Only Donald Trump had a lower rating. And so one would think that considering his age and unpopularity, Democrats would start looking at other possible candidates. Others maybe except for his vice president, Kamala Harris, who is even more unpopular than he is. Just 37.5% of those polled have favorable view of the vice president, according to the most recent Real Clear Politics average. But somehow Democrats seem hell-bent on losing. So they're turning to Harris, the least popular vice president in modern American history, as the most likely successor, the obvious favorite to replace Biden at the top of the ticket. A recent Harvard Caps Harris poll shows that Harris is still the early favorite among Democrats to be the nominee in 2024 if Biden doesn't run. 29% of those polled chose the vice president to lead a hypothetical ticket if President Biden doesn't run. The next highest polling option was Hillary Clinton, who was the top choice for 13% of respondents. Bernie Sanders was next with 9%, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez clocked in with 5%. Seriously? Harris, Hillary, Bernie, and AOC? These results should have Republicans rejoicing. Do many Democrats not get it? Are they delusional? Do they not care? Will there just be others who are going to come in later? Let's check in with pollster Carly Cooperman, CEO of Schoen Cooperman Research. Carly, thanks for coming on the show. Appreciate it. All right, so what is going on here? What is going on here with Democrats? Are they living in a fantasy world? Is it just too early? What's going on?
It is early. I think that I wasn't surprised by these poll results. I think that it's natural that Kamala, who is, the most well-known Democrat who's currently involved in politics right now, is going to be at the top of the ticket more so than someone far to the left like AOC, for instance. But what we're seeing right now is that Democrats are not particularly happy with anything that's going on right now, and they feel that there needs to be an effort, I think, to move away at least from the far left. We see the voters are unhappy right now with the far left and feel like the party is out of touch. And so someone like Kamala to be at the top of a ticket, who at least seems to be a more moderate alternative, I would expect her to be at the top right now relative to a far left candidate.
I have to tell you, I think that many Americans probably don't distinguish that much between, the far left and Kamala Harris. I mean, I know that inside the Democratic Party, maybe they do, but this notion that the leading candidates are all, are a lot of them, Bernie, AOC, Kamala Harris, the notion that Democrats are moving away from the far left of the party, those numbers would suggest to me that they're actually moving towards the far left of the party. No?
Those numbers you showed, 9%, 5%, those are really low. I mean, the fact that all of these numbers are so low really speaks more to the field of the Democratic Party candidates that they have right now. It's not like there's some alternative that we're not seeing pop that we would otherwise expect to see. Those are the people that are leading the Democratic Party right now. And I think that speaks to the fact that the Democratic Party's ratings are so low.
Yeah, I mean, and this was another question that was asked in the poll, the Harvard Caps Harris poll, which was, has the Democratic Party gone too far to the left, not far enough to the left, or just about right? And among Democrats, 47% said too far to the left, 28% just about right, and 26% not far enough. And yet, according to that study we were talking about at the top from that Progressive Institute, it does seem, according to them, that many Democrats still believe there is some sort of silent far left majority that's going to sort of rise up and somehow change things, which does feel delusional, no?
Yeah, no, I believe that polling data that shows that almost a majority of the Democrats are saying that their own party has gone too far to the left, to me feels like a reality. And we just saw in the State of the Union this week, Joe Biden both endorsing mask mandates being removed and speaking about funding and not defunding the police. He is trying to steer his party more to the center and acknowledging that there's a disconnect between what voters have been hearing and where voters want the party to be, specifically within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, again, you're right that the numbers are still all low with regard to those percentages. But boy, those numbers and the people who are the top four candidates. And, you know, I know that your partner, Doug Schoen, has proposed the possibility of Hillary Clinton running again. But as I said to Doug when he came on the show, it kind of feels like trolling. I don't think that she's actually going to run. But
yeah, I don't think she's going to run either. But I think the point is that speaks again to the dissatisfaction that Democrats have with their own party and that voters overall feel towards what they're seeing from Democrats right now.
I just think a lot of the time Democrats a lot of them just don't care about winning. And they want to just go with the policies that they want, and they want to live in a fantasy world where, you know, the world will all come out the way that they hope it does. And, you know, if that happens, at least according to this recent study, Democrats are going to get slaughtered in 2022 and maybe 2024. We shall see.
Yeah, look, there's two factions in the Democratic Party. There are definitely those that are ideologically driven and would put those preferences above winning. And I think there are Democrats, though, that do want to win. And all Democrats know that trouble is coming in 2022, especially if there's not a pivot.
Carly Cooperman, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.